Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at the Cold War in America. In our last lesson, we were looking at the United States following World War II and the ways in which our foreign policy will be shaped by World War II, leading us to this period of heightened tensions with the Soviet Union, also called the Cold War. Today's lesson, we're going to be looking at the impact of that foreign policy on domestic issues within the United States. And we're going to continue working in that timeline into the early 1960s and get hopefully a sense of how the United States is going to be entering a new era, but at times going to be falling back to some of the ideas of an older era. So following World War II, there was a Red Scare, and this Red Scare came out of lots of different things, part of it being the issues with the Soviets in Berlin, this need to make sure within the United States, exactly as it was following World War I, that things that seemed un-American were suspect and they had to be addressed. And well, with the nuclear age, we're looking at really heightened stakes. And between 1948 and 1954, both houses of Congress are going to get involved in this. But the second Red Scare for a lot of historians is really set off by this lovely couple at the top of my screen, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. And Ethel Rosenberg's brother had worked on the Manhattan Project. They were accused, because they were members of the Communist Party, of having given material that her brother had passed on to her, and they had passed on to the Soviets. And by 1949, the Soviets did have atomic bomb capabilities. They always denied the charges, but they were convicted and put to death. After the end of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, it was made known that they had had some involvement and had been involved in passing along state secrets. Whether that should have resulted in execution, perhaps not. But just to give you a sense of the hysteria that was starting to permeate American life. But the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, in 1948 will have a series of hearings. And again, this committee was just interviewing people. It was not as though people had been criminally charged, but they will begin to look at organizations like the Communist Party and the types of people who would have been members, particularly in the 1930s. And if you think about it, during the 1930s, we have the Great Depression. There's a lot of people thinking capitalism has failed. So you had people who might have gone to meetings. Sometimes they were members, but other times they had just been guests of people who were committed to the cause. But especially if people had a role in government or a role in media, they found themselves a target. And we will see 10 people in Hollywood alone. They're often called the Hollywood 10, but they were writers, directors, and other people who worked in the industry who were seen as highly influential, but who had, in most cases before World War II, been associated with the Communist Party, and found themselves blacklisted, meaning that they could not work in their profession. And for some of these people, that meant 10, 20 years. In other cases, they changed their name. Some people had to leave the country. But this was all part of this concern that the United States, for the most part, had certainly a State Department where most of the people who worked for it had been college educated. They came from the elites in American life. And beyond, you went to Harvard, you knew the right person, your uncle was a senator. These were the things that vetted you for holding these kinds of upper-level federal positions. And in 1950, a man named Alger Hiss was accused of having, again, passed along state secrets to Soviet agents, that he was committing espionage. And he actually had been outed by a man named Whittaker Chambers, who had been a member of the Communist Party, and said in the 1930s he had helped facilitate Alger Hiss passing on information. Alger Hiss always denied that he had done anything wrong, and even years after his trial, and later acquittal, and then he was tried again for perjury and found guilty, he always mandated that he had not passed along state secrets. And the jury's still out. After the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a lot of information that was made public. It turns out that the Army Signal Corps had been spending years doing counterintelligence operations, and so had the National Security Administration. And in fact, Alger Hiss's name never came up on their radar. So it's not to say that he wasn't passing along state secrets, but at least the people who were responsible for watching out for that kind of thing, it turned out that they never found anything about him. However, they had seen lots of things that Ethel and Julius Rosenberg had been involved in. But HUAC, some of the people who will be involved in those committee meetings will go on to have much larger political careers. If that face looks familiar, that's Richard Nixon, and he was a young congressman in 1948. By 1950, he's going to get enough national attention that he's going to run for Senate, and eventually will be vice president and then president of the United States. So there are people who are going to be called out as communists and suffer terrible consequences, and the people who are leading the charge, in some cases, are going to benefit tremendously from it. But Congress is going to feel there is this need, and certainly the American people are asking for security and safety. And so there will be lots of security acts of one sort of another passed in this time period. The Mccarran Internal Security Act was about registration of communist organizations, that yes, you can freely assemble in the United States, but if your organization is tied to the Communist Party in any way, you had to register with the government. The FBI is also going to investigate people in terms of their business relationships. Universities are going to start blacklisting professors. Again, a lot of people put their toe into the water about communism in the 1930s, especially intellectuals. So by the 1950s, choices they had made 15 and 20 years before, again, out of the circumstances of that time, came back to haunt them. Usually when we talk about the Second Red Scare, a lot of people talk about McCarthyism, and they know who McCarthy is, and they conflate him with what was going on with HUAC. This is yet a separate series of investigations that were done in the Senate between 1950 and 1954. That gentleman there is Senator Joseph McCarthy, who was not particularly well known outside of his home state. But in 1950, he gave a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, where he said he had proof. He had a list of 205 Americans who were committing acts of sabotage, espionage, doing things against the best interests of the country. They were committing acts of subversion. He never published this list. He just said he held it in his hands, and he called for a series, again, of investigations. And again, you see people whose lives are going to be upended, in some cases ruined, because of this McCarthyism. He will continue on doing this for another 3 years. And in 1954, he's going to go so far to say it's not just simply the State Department where you're going to find these subversive elements, but also in the U.S. military. And by coming after the U.S. Army, he's going to run afoul of President Eisenhower. If you remember, he rose to the rank of general, was a leader during World War II, and he took great offense to McCarthy saying that his fellow soldiers had anything to do with these acts. And he'll come out and finally speak against McCarthy. And maybe because they were of the same political party, they were both Republicans, early on, Eisenhower wouldn't directly address McCarthy, but by 1954, he's going to address this hysteria in America and talk about how dangerous it is, and ultimately shut down this investigation. And McCarthy, basically, his star will wane after this, and he'll die within a few years of alcoholism. But while he was at the height of his power, he was quite destructive. And we're always looking for parallels, comparing periods in U.S. history, and you can definitely do this. The first Red Scare and the second Red Scare. In the first Red Scare, we had investigations and arrests with the Palmer raids, and we're going to see J. Edgar Hoover and those who are involved with HUAC and the McCarthy trials, all attempting to put on display people that they accuse of having communist leanings and having committed communist acts, whether or not they really had hard evidence or not. There's also going to be, between the two time periods, a large amount of culture that is in upheaval in the same way that we saw the 20s with new music and migration and kind of upending American life in a lot of ways after World War I. We see a similar thing happening after World War II. The music that's going to emerge by the mid-50s is rock and roll. You're going to see people who are going to question what are the traditional norms in society. They're going to be outliers in the 1950s. By the 1960s, they are going to be people who are going to be reshaping the country socially in ways like the civil rights movement. And there was certainly a reaction outside of President Eisenhower's to McCarthyism. An example of that will be Arthur Miller's The Crucible, if you've ever read that play or seen it. It is a story of the Salem witch trials and the people who are accused of being witches and how that destroys their lives with no evidence. And the author of that play had seen himself and lots of other friends falsely accused and wanted to show people that this wasn't the first time in history where we had people who were simply being accused. And maybe they held beliefs that were different from other people, but it didn't mean that they were un-American and they were people who should be prosecuted or persecuted. And we talked a little bit about Eisenhower's agenda in the last lesson, but we want to now look at his second term in particular, because Eisenhower will come into office in 1952, and a lot of the focus will be on issues in places like Vietnam, Central America, and Guatemala, and certainly the domestic hysteria that's around McCarthyism. But there are going to be some global conflicts that are going to make Eisenhower have to kind of reconsider what has been the foreign policy of his predecessor, Harry Truman. The Soviets, certainly the standoff with them in Europe and then in Korea, that was something that the U.S. at times was triumphant and other times not so much. But by the late 1950s, we're going to see issues happening elsewhere in the globe that don't directly involve the United States, but is going to make the United States have to look again at how it interacts with other nations, especially those that haven't been the traditional allies that we've had with Western Europe. So in 1956, there was an incident known as the Suez Crisis. The Suez Canal, much like the Panama Canal, is a man-made waterway. This one connects the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. And one of the things that's important about it is following World War II, we move away from the U.S. being the major producer of petroleum globally, and it becomes the Middle East. And much of the oil that is going to travel out of the Middle East to Europe, about 2/3 of it in 1956, comes from the Middle East. Europe is reliant upon this region. And with decolonization, there's been some upheaval. You're going to see now some independent countries. And one of those will be Egypt. It's no longer a colonial possession of Great Britain. And Egypt in 1956 will nationalize the Suez Canal. It had been built by the French. It was controlled as a French and British entity for more than 50 years. And in 1956, Egypt said that they would take control and they would be responsible for piloting ships and they would charge what they wished. And ultimately, we're taking control of this canal that was adjacent to their nation. The French, the British, very unhappy with this. And so was the nation of Israel. And the three of them together attempted to invade Egypt and try to take back control of the Suez. The Soviet Union saw this as a great opportunity to intervene, and they reached out to Egypt and said, let us know what we can do. Even if that's just sending people to help you manage the canal until you can do that independently, or if you need some sort of military support, we would be happy to provide that too. But Eisenhower suddenly realized that the US really hadn't done much with the Middle East and hadn't really made the same kinds of overtures with Middle Eastern nations as they had with Europe and certain parts of Asia. And so the Eisenhower doctrine will be shaped around the idea that in the Middle East, that nations there, if they felt that they were in economic turmoil, if they needed some kind of further military support, especially if it was a crisis coming out of anything to do with their own independent sovereignty after the end of colonization, that there would be money available, much like the Marshall Plan in Europe in the late 1940s. It will be controversial because certainly critics, the Soviet Union, said this was just an attempt to try to win favor. Also, that much of that money early on will go to nations like Israel, and kind of feed into the other geopolitical and religious issues in that region. But the Eisenhower Doctrine is yet a further evolution of that Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine focusing again on Greece and Turkey and providing economic and military support in those regions adjacent to Europe. And now we're looking towards the Middle East. Eisenhower will also see an attempted revolution in 1956 in Hungary. If you remember, that's one of many countries that will ultimately be occupied by the Soviets following World War II. And they'll never really relinquish control. The government that's there is basically a puppet state under the control of the Soviet Union. And a young people's revolution, college-age kids, will arise in 1956 and will be harshly put down by the Soviets. And Eisenhower says it's not something for the US to intervene, that we have no stake in the game, that we don't have a direct connection with Hungary, and it's not something that we can intervene in. And there are people who say, and said at the time, that ultimately empowered the Soviet Union to believe that in other places like Romania, East Germany, Poland, they could continue to have very harsh, strict control of those places, knowing that the United States would not directly intervene. Domestically, Eisenhower, we spoke about it in the last class, not only if we're going to see this huge investment in our highway system as a part of greater defense, but we're also going to see a lot of federal money going towards education. And that really hadn't happened before 1957. But there was this belief that the United States had to catch up to the Soviets, and science and math was going to be the way to do that. And so there needed to be more funding for better teaching, and also in high schools providing a more robust level of instruction in the sciences and math. Eisenhower will also face another problem at the end of his second term, which will be the U-2 crisis. The U-2 is a spy plane, it's still in use today. It flies at very high altitude, about 70,000 feet, which is about twice what a commercial airliner flies at. The U-2 was something that the Soviets knew we had, but we swore we never used it to fly over our enemies. We might use it for the purposes of other things that we might need it for, but we would never invade Soviet airspace. And in 1960, Gary Powers, who was the pilot of this particular U-2 plane, is shot down, smack dab in the middle of Russia. And his plane, when it's shot down, the U.S. pretends outrage that, oh, it was just a weather plane. It was just collecting scientific information. It flew off course, yada, yada, yada. Well, within 5 days, that plane had been taken apart. Gary Powers had been interviewed, to put it mildly, and it was apparent that this was a spy plane taking photographs of the Soviet Union, of military installations. It had nothing to do with meteorology, and that Gary Powers himself was a Navy pilot. And so at that point, the Eisenhower administration has egg on their face, because it's one thing to spy. It's another thing to lie about your spying and then be caught in that lie. So Eisenhower is going to have, within the time period that he's president, both triumphs and tragedies. And probably the greatest triumph that's going to come starting in his second administration, and certainly throughout the Kennedy era and the Johnson era, is the beginnings of the space race. So NASA was created in 1958. Again, as we're investing in science and education and defense, we're looking towards control, right? We're trying to exert as much control as we can across the globe, but we also can have control if we're going to space. Especially in the use of things like satellites. NASA early on, sometimes by days, if just by weeks, will be outdone by the Soviets in terms of the timeline. But the United States will produce by 1959 satellites. By 1961, they're going to be sending men in space. However, the Soviets are going to get there first. Sputnik was the first man-made satellite launched into space, and actually all it did was send a signal. It went around the Earth, and about every hour or so left a beep, just letting us know it had made its revolution. But the fact that on American radios you could hear this beep, and it meant that the Soviets were above us, was quite unnerving. The U.S. within days will send their own satellite up, and obviously we use satellites for all kinds of communication and other things today. But we will also be interested in sending men into space. Eventually we'll put a man on the moon. And that first space flight that's going to take place is simply to get a man into space and return him safely. And then it's going to be to orbit around the Earth. And then it's going to be able to orbit around the moon and back. And by 1969, we'll actually put a man on the moon. But all of that endeavor wasn't necessarily for the purpose of greater defense. In some ways, it was a way of competing with the Soviets. It was just simply, can we get there first? Can we do it quicker? Ultimately, the U.S. will be the only country to land men on the moon, or at least through 2021. But the space race is going to be something that captures the American imagination. Early on, until the late 1970s, all of the astronauts were male. Most of them were test pilots. They'd served in the Navy, either in World War II or later on in Vietnam. But they will become national heroes each time they make these journeys. And the United States is going to use this as a way of showing further triumph over the Soviets. And we're going to see it in lots of other ways. We're going to see it in Olympic competition. But wherever the U.S. and the Soviets go head to head, the U.S. wants to outshine. And the space race is one of those areas outside of the military where we see that. But there is also an arms race. And as we talked about massive retaliation in the last lecture, it's important to understand that by the time we get to 1960, we are looking at huge numbers when it comes to defense spending. About 60% of the national budget in 1960 went towards defense. About 9% was used for things like pensions, including Social Security. Quite different today. I know people still complain about military spending, but it's actually only about 15% of the 2020 budget. But the arms race is going to seem to be unending. That every time the United States has some type of innovation in terms of its nuclear program, the Soviets quickly catch up. And we're going to see proliferation. There are going to be so many weapons, and the United States is constantly worried that there's going to be a missile gap. There's going to be some place where there are missiles directed at the United States, and therefore we've got to have other installations to direct missiles at the Soviets. And by the time he leaves office, Eisenhower is going to give a farewell address, much in the way that George Washington did. And if you think about it, there's some similarities between those two men. They're both former generals. They were both people who hadn't been involved in politics. And then after that military career, becoming presidents at a time when people felt they needed a commander-in-chief, somebody who would have a real knowledge and could really direct the military. But Eisenhower walked away from 8 years in office and had some pretty choice things to say. One of his big concerns was the fact that what had evolved, especially out of this arms race, was what he called a military industrial complex. And if we look at his words, you can see that he writes, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and the large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Ultimately, he was reflecting on several things. One, the cultural hysteria that had come out of these communist witch hunts, the second Red Scare. But also, it was fed by the fact that the U.S. was spending billions of dollars a year, originally to put bombs, eventually to put missiles all over the globe in order to protect ourselves and provide a defense against the Soviets who were doing the same thing. And that the people who were making these weapons, this is private industry. The U.S. government is paying private companies to make these things. And in doing so, well, you know what? If I buy, these weapons from these producers, they're incented to keep making better bombs, more of them, better missiles, more of those. And so he said, ultimately, it's a pretty unhealthy relationship. And his concern was, where will it end? And kind of left that for the next president to have to try to solve. But these pictures, these are children having participated in the duck and cover drill. This advertisement is for a video that was sent to schools for children to watch. You'll have the opportunity to see it in a little bit. And it was cartoons trying to educate children that if there was ever a nuclear holocaust, what do you do to save yourself? And it turns out what they were telling people to do really, in fact, probably would not save you from nuclear Armageddon. But you've done lockdown drills. You know that there's a heightened sense of insecurity and fear. And this was being done on a massive scale in the name of safety. And Eisenhower questioned where that was going to go. And you can see this bomb shelter that a family has built. Not that everybody in America built them, but you could find kits. You could find all kinds of instructions if you wanted to provide your own materials to do this. But there were people who went and built bomb structures. And this idea that if there was a nuclear attack, there would be some kind of shelter. So the foreign policy of the country is truly permeating the psyche of the American people, young and old. One of the other things that will look pretty poor on Eisenhower's resume is that although the CIA is going to be intervening in Central America, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East in the 1950s, the one thing they failed to pick up on was that there were the seeds of communist revolution brewing in Cuba. And in 1959, there was essentially a bloodless communist revolution that took over there and got rid of the pro-U.S. Batista government. Eisenhower made a point of having the CIA attempt to address this. They had failed on their watch. This communist insurgency had occurred 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and started putting into effect what would hopefully be a counter-revolution by those who were still pro-U.S. and pro-capitalist living in Cuba. It becomes known as the Bay of Pigs invasion because that area on the map, that beachhead, is called the Bay of Pigs. And it was left for the Kennedy administration, who comes into office in January of 1961, to put into effect. And it was something that JFK came to regret. He was told that there were enough people in Cuba who would support any kind of CIA overtures in terms of money and weapons. to effect yet basically a counter-revolution. And it didn't come to be. It failed within 48 hours, and the Castro government used it as propaganda to show that the United States didn't want a communist power to exist. And it wasn't simply that there had been aggressive overtures made by Cuba, but that this was U.S. capitalistic dominance that had existed prior to the revolution, and it was America trying to gain that control once again. And Cuba is going to become a very sore spot for the Kennedy administration because Fidel Castro, if you don't know anything about him, was a very well-educated, very smart man. He had an early career, a college student, wanted to play baseball, couldn't quite make it to the big leagues, decided, okay, I'm going to, you know what, work on becoming an attorney, taking care of my people in Cuba. But he was a very talented lawyer, very talented speaker. And he realized that Cuba was going to survive if it had a trade partner. And if it was a communist nation, its trade partner had to be the Soviet Union. And because it could not produce much of the food that was required for its population, it was going to have these relationships. The U.S. cut Cuba off. There'll be an embargo, which was only lifted in the Obama administration. So the Soviets, they need something in return. And what they wanted was to be able to build missile silos on Cuba. Now, when missile silos controlled by the Soviets were on the other side of the globe, it was one thing. But to have these silos, potentially nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles pointed at the United States, I mean, it would be mere minutes before you could have a nuclear attack on our capital. That was not okay. In October of 1962, there will be a U-2 spy plane who will fly over and notice that there is a site where they are digging and they are building silos. There's no set weapons yet, or it didn't seem like it, but the silos themselves were being built. And on October 20 of 1962, the Kennedy administration can't just pick up the phone and call Khrushchev, who was the premier of the Soviet Union, because they did not have a direct connection to one another. The best he can do is send word to the ambassador to the Soviet Union and then get on national TV, and hopefully it's broadcast internationally, saying that the Soviets need to stop this building of silos on Cuba, and that the U.S. is going to set a naval blockade around Cuba, 20 ships. And that blockade is not to be disrupted. That if Soviet ships come in and attempt to bring any material that could be used to build these silos and build missiles, it's on. And to the American people for 13 days, they waited to find out, well, what exactly did that mean? Did it mean that the U.S. was on the brink of nuclear war? And for a lot of people, they felt that that's exactly what was happening. And in the end, the Soviets turned their ships around. They did not try to go against the blockade. By November 2nd, word had been sent out by the Khrushchev administration that they would cease and wanted to talk. They wanted to be able to broker some kind of policy with the U.S. and the Soviet Union in terms of nuclear proliferation. But ultimately, what was going on is what people called MAD, mutually assured destruction. There was so much nuclear material that could be utilized for the purposes of destroying each country. You could ultimately destroy the world. And people can't live in fear, that there had to be some resolution. And that resolution ultimately will come through something that Kennedy will call flexible response. His defense secretary is a man named Robert McNamara. And he said, look, I think we need to have a doctrine that isn't focused just on nuclear capacity. That's what the Eisenhower administration had done. And in light of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we need to lessen some tension. So the first thing is that not only are we going to direct our military spending elsewhere, not just simply on the nuclear arsenal, but also we're going to increase the size of the army. We want to have, if we're going to have a military presence, it's going to be boots on the ground versus weapons pointed in multiple directions across the globe. We're also going to see that Kennedy and Khrushchev are going to be able to meet, begin to talk, actually get a phone line connected from the White House to the Kremlin. So if they do need to speak, they could. It's kind of crazy to think that after World War II, there was no direct line or direct communication until 1963 between the Soviet Union and the United States. But the Soviets are still going to encourage communism across the globe. They are going to empower their friends to continue to have totalitarian regimes. We see that in Berlin in 1962 with the building of the Berlin Wall. So if you go to Berlin today, you can actually see they have marked and left just a small section of the wall up. But ultimately, starting in 1961, they had created a temporary fence barrier that was the divide between East and West Berlin. Over the course of the next year, this became fortified with machine gun nests, guard dogs. And when you went to Berlin in those days, you literally could see the symbols of the older German Republic cut in half. People woke up one day and they could no longer see their neighbor in the West because of this wall. And people were killed trying to cross it. And it stayed up until 1989. But in 1963, about a year after completion, not only did that wall go through Berlin, it actually went through much of Germany. You see that Kennedy wanted to reach out and make it known that he did not agree with this, that ultimately, if he's having conversations about perhaps having less nuclear proliferation and more opportunities to talk with the Soviets encouraging the East German government to build this wall kind of worked against that. But he actually flew into Berlin in 1963. He went to the wall and he gave a speech. It's known as the Ich bin ein Berliner, or I am a Berliner speech. And he spoke about the fact that every person in the world could be a Berliner, that people want to be free, and that ultimately if communism is legitimate, then you don't have walls to stop people from getting out. And that ultimately that is a flaw in these communist totalitarian regimes that have been popping up across the globe in the 20th century. He'll also facilitate with the Soviets a test ban treaty. So there had been a lot of nuclear testing specifically by the United States and the Soviets in the Pacific Ocean. Throughout the 1950s and early 60s. And this was a goal that if we were not doing these kinds of tests, that ultimately that would also decrease nuclear proliferation. Unfortunately, Kennedy will be assassinated in November of 1963. And so much of his plans and work, he never had the opportunity to continue to build upon him. It will be his vice president, Johnson, who will make some attempts more to utilize flexible response than anything else. But we'll get to that in another lesson. So as we close out, I want you to consider four things. The first one is, what are the similarities and differences between the first Red Scare that we saw in the 1920s and the second Red Scare that takes place in the late 1940s, early 1950s? Second, what's the domestic impact of the Cold War? So what is going on in terms of our foreign policy at the time that is going to impact how Americans are acting and reacting, how our government is acting towards other Americans? The third thing is the nuclear strategy that evolves in the 1950s and 60s. To what degree is it creating more conflict? And how does the United States then begin to try to pull back and lessen those tensions? And then the last thing is, to what extent did the Cold War affect constitutional ideas and national identity? To be an American, certainly in the mid-1800s, people weren't talking about capitalism as an American ideology, but we certainly are by the 1950s. Constitutionally, What does it mean to be told or feel public pressure or investigation because you wish to associate and assemble, read and write about a point of view that is not mainstream in America? And simply because it is about communism, does that ultimately make you un American? These were the big issues of the day, some of which really don't get resolved until the 1980s and 1990s. And I would argue to this day, there are times when we look at how people express themselves and perhaps want to limit them because they are ideas that are seen as unpopular or challenging to what is the mainstream opinion in American life. We'll catch you next time. We'll be looking at the nifty 50s and how, in many ways, it's similar to the roaring 20s in our next lesson.